Who contacted you? My father's question made my hand freeze around my phone. I hadn't told him anyone had contacted me. We were sitting at breakfast at a coastal resort, 17 years after David Bennett had packed my clothes into 2 bags and sent 9-year-old me to live with my grandmother. Minutes earlier, he'd looked across the table and laughed. At least you finally learned how to behave. My mother, Laura, immediately reached for the coffee pot. David, don't start. He shrugged. What? Abigail knows what she was like. I was 26, financially independent, and perfectly capable of standing up for myself anywhere else. But around him, one sentence could turn me back into the little girl who spent years wondering what she had done to deserve being thrown away. Then my phone vibrated beneath the table. Fly home today. Say anything to your parents. I deleted it. Another message appeared seconds later. It contained my full name and flight information. Then one sentence changed everything. This concerns the real reason your father removed you from his home when you were 9. I looked up. Dad was laughing with my younger brother, as though my childhood had been nothing more than an embarrassing family story. I booked the earliest flight home beneath the table. I have a work emergency, I said. I need to leave. That was when Dad stopped smiling. Who contacted you? My stomach tightened. No one. His eyes stayed on mine. Then why are you suddenly flying home? Mom stared down at her plate. I stood because I said I have work. For once, I didn't wait for his permission. Hours later, I walked through arrivals expecting the mysterious sender to be some stranger trying to sell me a family secret. Instead, a gray-haired man in a navy suit approached me. Abigail Bennett. Yes. I'm Marcus Reed. I represented your grandfather Thomas's estate. 2 people stood several feet behind him. I noticed their badges. Police. My pulse jumped. Is my father in trouble? Marcus glanced toward the officers. That depends on what these records prove. He led me into a private airport office and closed the door. What does this have to do with me being thrown out? Marcus sat opposite me. Before I answer that, there's something you need to see. He removed an old photograph from a file. The moment it touched the table, my breath caught. I was in it. 9 years old. Standing outside my childhood home with 2 bags beside me. It was the morning Dad sent me away. But that wasn't what terrified me. Through the open front door behind me, my grandfather Thomas and my father were visible inside the house, arguing. Between them was a dark folder. I remembered that folder. Not clearly, just fragments, papers scattered across the floor, Grandpa shouting, Dad's face changing when he noticed me in the hallway. For 17 years, whenever I mentioned that night, Dad insisted there had been no argument. You imagined half of it, Abigail. Marcus leaned forward. Do you remember what was inside that folder? My mouth went dry. No. Try. I stared at the photograph until another fragment surfaced. Grandpa's voice. Angry. That money belonged to her. I looked at Marcus. Why are the police here? He didn't answer immediately. And suddenly, the question that had followed me since I was 9 changed completely. I had spent 17 years asking what I had done that made my father throw me out. Now I needed to know something else. Why had my father spent 17 years pretending that folder never existed? Before I show you anything else, Marcus said, pulling the photograph back toward him, I need you to tell me exactly what you remember about that night. I stared at him. You already know what happened, don't you? I know what the documents say. The investigators need to know what you remember without me putting details in your head. One of the officers switched on a recorder with my permission. I closed my eyes. I woke up because Grandpa was shouting. The memory came back in pieces. I was 9, standing barefoot at the top of the stairs while voices came from my father's study. Grandpa Thomas sounded furious. That money belonged to her. Dad answered something I couldn't make out. Then Grandpa shouted again. You had no authority. I remembered creeping toward the study. Then Dad stepped into the hallway and saw me. His face changed instantly. Not anger. Fear. What are you doing down here? He snapped. I heard Grandpa. Go upstairs. What money? Dad grabbed my shoulders and turned me toward the staircase. Upstairs, Abigail, now. The next morning, I woke to the sound of drawers opening. Dad was packing my clothes. What are you doing? He didn't answer. I ran downstairs and found Mom standing beside 2 bags. Mom. She wouldn't look at me. Then Dad said the sentence that divided my childhood into before and after. She cannot stay here anymore. I remembered grabbing his arm. I'm sorry. Even now, saying those words made my throat tighten. Marcus frowned. Sorry for what? I didn't know. I had begged anyway. I'll be good. Daddy, please tell me what I did. He never did. Mom drove me to Grandma Evelyn's house that afternoon. Within weeks, the explanation started changing. First, I was told I needed space. Then Dad said I had behavioral problems. As I got older, his accusations became more detailed. I supposedly lied constantly. I stole things. I caused violent arguments. Eventually, he even claimed I had frightened my younger brother. After hearing those stories for years, I stopped trusting my own memories. Marcus folded his hands. Were you ever taken to a therapist for these behavioral problems? No. Suspended from school? No. Were police ever called because you were violent? No. Child Protective Services? I shook my head. Marcus opened another file. Then you should see what everyone outside your house was saying about you. He placed my elementary school records in front of me. Teacher evaluations. Attendance records. Behavior reports. Quiet. Polite. High-performing. No suspensions. No violent incidents. No disciplinary pattern. Nothing matching the child my father had described for 17 years. I slowly pushed the papers away. If I wasn't sent away because of my behavior. Marcus watched me carefully. For the first time, I stopped asking what had been wrong with 9-year-old me. I looked at the old photograph again. What was my father hiding? Marcus reached for a sealed evidence envelope. He opened it, removed a bank statement, and slid it across the table. My name was printed at the top. Abigail BNNETT. I followed the transactions down the page. Large withdrawals. Transfers. Dates from when I was 9 years old. Then I reached the authorization field. My stomach dropped. Authorized by David Bennett. My father. Why was money leaving my account when I was 9? I didn't get to ask my father privately. By the time Marcus and I returned to the city, Dad already knew I had met him. He called an emergency family meeting at my Aunt Caroline's house. When I walked into her living room, my parents were there with several relatives. Dad stood near the fireplace like he was about to give a presentation. There she is, he said. Mom looked exhausted. Dad turned to everyone else. Abigail has been contacted by people digging into old family matters. They're taking advantage of her resentment about her childhood. There it was. The same strategy he had used since I was 9. Make me unreliable before I could speak. Dad continued. She's always struggled with what happened back then. Why was money leaving my trust account when I was 9? Silence. Dad's expression changed. What trust account? I almost laughed. Aunt Caroline didn't. David, don't do that. Dad turned toward her. Do what? Pretend you didn't know. Mom whispered, Caroline. But my aunt kept going. Dad talked about Abigail's trust constantly. He started it after she was born. I looked at her. Grandpa created it. Yes, investments, inheritance money, things he wanted protected for your education and your future. Dad interrupted. Thomas discussed many financial arrangements. That doesn't mean I controlled them. I opened my bag. Marcus had authorized me to disclose one document. I placed the bank statement on the coffee table. You had administrative access while I was a minor. Nobody moved. I pointed at the transfers. This money left an account with my name on it and went into an account connected to you. Mom covered her mouth. Dad's voice sharpened. You have absolutely no idea what you're looking at. Then explain it. I don't have to defend 17-year-old financial decisions to my daughter in front of the entire family. Aunt Caroline picked up the statement. David, these aren't small withdrawals. Dad snatched it from her. Mom started crying. I turned toward her. Mom, did you know? She stared at the floor. Dad stepped between us. That's enough. No. His head snapped toward me. It was the first time I could remember saying that word to him without immediately trying to soften it. You spent 17 years telling everyone I was thrown out because something was wrong with me, I said. So if that happened the morning after Grandpa confronted you about my money, I deserve an explanation. You're destroying this family over something you don't understand. No, I'm asking what happened to me. My relatives began talking at once. David, where did the money go? Why was Abigail sent away? Why didn't any of us know? For once, the questions weren't aimed at me. Dad's control of the room was disappearing. Then he made a mistake. He slammed the statement onto the table. Your grandfather had no right to keep those records. Everything stopped. I stared at him. I had never said Grandpa kept anything. Neither had Marcus. Aunt Caroline slowly lowered her hand. What records, David? Dad's face went pale. Behind me, the living room door opened. Marcus Reed stepped inside. He had heard enough. Mr. Bennett, he said calmly, that is exactly what the police wanted to know you knew about. Dad grabbed his jacket. This conversation is over. He pushed past Marcus and headed for the front door. I followed him outside. 2 investigators were waiting near the driveway. Dad stopped. One of them stepped forward. Mr. Bennett, we need to formally notify you that financial records connected to the Abigail Bennett Trust are under investigation. Am I under arrest? Not at this time. Dad looked back at me. For 17 years, that look had been enough to make me question myself. This time, I stayed where I was. Inside, I turned to Marcus. You knew this could become a criminal investigation before I landed. The independent audit uncovered transactions we couldn't reasonably explain, he said. That's why authorities were contacted. Then why message me during the vacation? Because the audit was finally complete. Marcus explained that Grandpa Thomas had died months earlier, but his estate instructions were specific. Certain documents could not be released to me until an independent review of the trust had been completed. That review had just ended. And suddenly, 17 years of disconnected memories began lining up. Grandpa shouting about money. Dad finding me outside the study. 2 bags packed the next morning. Dad later insisting I had imagined the argument. Mom refusing every attempt I made to discuss that night. I found her alone in Caroline's kitchen. Mom. She wiped her face quickly. I closed the door behind me. Did Dad send me away because I saw Grandpa confronting him? She said nothing. Look at me. Slowly, she did. You drove me to Grandma, I said. I begged you the whole way to take me home. Her lips trembled. What were you protecting? Your father said you overheard something you shouldn't have. My chest tightened. What? He called it dangerous. He said the dispute with your grandfather had gotten out of control, and you needed to stay with Mom until everything settled. Then why didn't I come home? Laura looked away. Because it never settled. And you let him tell everyone I was unstable. I was afraid of what would happen if I challenged him. You were the adult. She covered her face. I stepped back. For 17 years, I had wondered why my mother never came for me. Now I knew she had understood enough to know my removal wasn't really about my behavior. But Marcus appeared in the doorway before I could ask anything else. Abigail. Something in his expression silenced the room. The investigators finished reviewing your grandfather's preserved correspondence. Mom lowered her hands. Marcus continued. There's a document explaining why Thomas changed the trust arrangements immediately after your father removed you from the house. What does it say? Marcus pulled out a chair. You should sit down before you read it. Before I could move, one of the investigators entered carrying an old sealed file. He placed it carefully on the kitchen table. My grandfather's name was written across the front. The investigator looked directly at me. Abigail, your grandfather wrote down exactly what happened that night. My hands shook as Marcus opened my grandfather's file. Inside was a written account, dated just days after Dad threw me out. Marcus placed it in front of me. I started reading. Grandpa Thomas had discovered that my father was making unauthorized withdrawals from the trust created for me after I was born. At first, Dad apparently claimed the money was temporary. He would replace it. But the withdrawals kept growing. So Grandpa confronted him. That was the argument I heard when I was 9. I could suddenly see the study again. Papers scattered across the floor. Grandpa pointing at Dad. That belongs to Abigail. Then another memory surfaced. A sheet of paper beside my foot. 9-year-old me bending down and picking it up. I whispered. I was holding one of the statements. Marcus nodded. Grandpa had written exactly that. During their argument, Dad knocked the folder from Thomas's hands. Documents scattered across the floor, and I picked one up. Then Dad saw me. That was why his face changed. I hadn't understood bank accounts, trusts, or withdrawals. But I had seen Grandpa accusing him. And I could remember it. Dad knew that. So the next morning, he packed my bags. Not because I was violent. Not because I lied. Not because I endangered my brother. He removed me because I had witnessed something he desperately wanted buried. Then he convinced Mom to support a story that I had serious behavioral problems. What began as a cover story became my identity inside the family. Grandpa understood what Dad had done. He revoked Dad's remaining access to my trust, secured the surviving assets, and preserved every document he could. Grandma Evelyn agreed to raise me while those financial protections were established. And the evidence was kept until it could legally reach me. I lowered the document. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Dad appeared in the doorway. He must have returned from speaking with the investigators. His eyes went immediately to Grandpa's file. You read it. I stood. He started toward me. Abigail, you need to understand what was happening back then. I placed the photograph of 9-year-old me on the table between us. 2 bags. A frightened child. A father standing behind her with a secret. You don't understand what pressure I was under, he said. I stared at him. I was 9. Dad opened his mouth. Nothing came out. I spent 17 years trying to remember what I did wrong, I said. Every time I questioned you, you gave me another reason to hate that little girl. I was trying to protect the family. You were protecting yourself. Mom began crying behind me. I'm sorry, Abigail. I turned toward her. She reached for my hand, but I stepped back. I should have stopped him, she whispered. I should have come for you. Yes. That single word hit harder than shouting could have. I chose my marriage, she said. And I was your child. She lowered her hand. I didn't forgive her that day. An apology could acknowledge 17 years. It couldn't return them. The financial records were formally turned over to investigators. Dad lost access to the remaining family-controlled assets while the matter proceeded, and the relatives who had spent years hearing stories about my supposed instability finally learned where those stories came from. Mom eventually separated from him. Dad wanted me to tell relatives the situation was complicated. I refused. He wanted me to help keep the investigation private. I refused that too. For the first time, his reputation wasn't mine to protect. The surviving trust, assets, and investments Grandpa had secured passed under my control. But the money wasn't the part that changed me. Dad had controlled where I lived when I was 9. Then he controlled the story of why. At 26, he controlled neither. Months later, I visited Grandma Evelyn's grave. I brought the photograph. I sat beside her headstone and studied the little girl standing beside those 2 bags. For most of my life, I had looked backward searching for her mistake. Maybe she talked too much. Maybe she was difficult. Maybe she had done something terrible and simply couldn't remember. Now I knew the truth. She hadn't been thrown out because of something she did. She had been removed because of something she saw. I kept limited contact with Mom, with boundaries she knew were not negotiable. I ended contact with Dad. And slowly, I stopped treating my childhood like a crime scene where I was the suspect. I finally understood why my father threw me out at 9. He needed me to doubt my memory before I became old enough to trust it. But 17 years later, his secret survived neither the records nor the truth. My father threw me out when I was 9 so I would doubt what I saw, but 17 years later, the truth gave me back the one thing he had taken before the money: my trust in myself.